Tahlequah is the heart of the Cherokee Reservation. My father was originally sent here in the early 30s. He and his siblings were sent to boarding school. I personally have lived at 4 boarding schools, and most of my years was spent at Seneca Indian School.
Deborah does well in school and graduates from nursing college. She then goes back to work in her community.
Everybody knows Deb. She's always out in the public. Very kind, very sweet. Always out to help anybody and everybody. You know, she's a very good-hearted lady.
I'm very active in my community, and it's just a celebration of the Cherokee. It can be community activities, friendships, concerts, might be birthdays. There are the powwows, there's the parade, there's tournaments, softball, golf. We love golf. I've been playing golf a while, years and years.
Deborah has spent almost her entire life on the reservation, and even married and then divorced a local non-native man. In 1998, she's single with 2 sons when she decides to broaden her horizons by posting a dating profile online.
I had hoped for a long-term relationship. I wasn't looking to move, but if someone was free to move here, that was an option for me. I met a number of gentlemen, but the one that seemed the most appealing to me, his name was Jeff Walton. Jeff's profile shared of all the things he had done in his life. He was a golfer, he was a pilot, he was a project manager for large industry, construction. He'd gone to Ohio State and played football with Woody Hayes.
They exchange messages, and he tells her that he had been married and divorced once and has 1 son. When they finally talk on the phone, Deborah is charmed.
His favorite word was darling, in a New Orleans accent. I just thought that was amazing. When he began to talk about Native American music, I think I was just gone at that point. I was like, this guy really gets me.
3 months into their online relationship, Jeff tells Deborah that business is bringing him to Oklahoma. It's time to meet.
I had a big event planned. I was having my family over, and I was having dinner, and I'd fix dessert, and, just doing a home welcome. Here's my family, welcome to Tahlequah, that kind of thing. Everyone came but Jeff.
Jeff is a no-show.
Well, I was sick at my stomach. And then he reached out in an email, and that's when he explained what all had happened. His mother had called him home to Canada. His brother John was missing. The family was worried about him, and he just had to go home. I just felt such compassion for them that he was missing.
I've known Deb a long time. She is a good judge of character. I felt cautious, but I also felt happy for Deb. She told me all about him. She showed me pictures. She was just happy as could be.
When Jeff's brother returns, with little explanation, Jeff is ready to carry on where he and Deborah left off.
He came here on April 23rd, 1998. I went to visit a medicine man, and I did have him bead a feather. Then I gave that to Jeff when I picked him up at the airport. It's a part of my culture. I was very nervous, very nervous. It's scary, because I'd been single a number of years. I really loved this guy, and I'd never met him. And our first weekend together, I took him all around, introduced him to as many friends as I could, took him to my golf course. Everyone was friendly. Even my guy friends were friendly. It was beautiful. It was very lovely. My boys, they liked him. He's a very personable guy. And One of my dearest golf friends was like, well, I'm not sure that you know yet, do you? And I go, oh yeah, this is the one.
He was handsome. He was kind. He had that New Orleans drawl. He treated her like a princess. In fact, he called her my Indian princess.
Katie's husband, Jesse, isn't as impressed.
We hug each other here. And they gave each other a hug.
And then Jeff does an odd thing.
Well, Jeff put Jesse in a headlock. No one was looking. And so, I was just thinking, why would he do that? Well, later on, Jesse told me he hurt him because his back's jacked up. And then he said something to him like, oh, you sissy, or something.
Later, Jeff reveals another surprising side of himself that Deborah had been unaware of when he goes to dinner with Deborah and her sons.
And something came up about him being a veteran, and he told both my sons. He said, I will let you ask me one question about my being a veteran, about being in the Vietnam War. We began to learn about the prisoner of war story and the horrors of it. They were ambushed, his unit, and he was captured, and they took a gun butt and busted his feet, and he was able to finally get free and followed water back to American troops. I just thought he was a phenomenal man with all that he had done in his life. There was an annual trip that we typically made right after Christmas, and I typically would travel with all my golf couples. And so finally I was like, now I have a golf partner.
4 couples, including Jeff and Deborah, travel to Florida to play golf. But there's a small problem.
He didn't bring his golf clubs. A real golfer is not going to lose their clubs. But he said his was taken. So we bought him all new clubs. 8 of you can't play together, so we always played in different groups.
The guys play together on the first day, and Jeff stuns Deborah when he wins the tournament and a pot of money. But he's the only one happy about it.
I noticed that there was a strangeness. There was a distance, and these were my close friends. I've traveled with them for years, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And I learned that what happened, and they were just observing cheating. And they witnessed that. He might not count all of his strokes, or if he hit out of bounds, he wouldn't take his penalty shot. And if you cheat, that says a lot about you.
Deborah turns to her best friend Katie for advice.
She was crying. She was upset because they were bad-mouthing Jeff, which made me upset. They just didn't like his personality. They didn't like to be around him.
After we made that trip to Florida, that we weren't invited anymore. That was the end of our couples traveling out of state every year.
Despite this, Jeff decides to leave his home and contractor job in Kentucky to live with Deborah in Oklahoma.
He expressed that he liked it here, and we began to talk about him moving. That was the next plan that we talked about. I was just really committed. We'll find work for you. I was just all in, fully committed. I just felt so warm in his presence, I just felt such love in my heart for him.
3 months after they first met, Jeff arrives in Oklahoma, and Deborah rushes to the airport.
It was a little late, so he was already off the plane and out into the big common area, and his voice was kind of shaking. And so I was like, well, I guess he's really scared, I would be too. He's really taken a big step, giving up everything. Of course, he's probably a little frightened, But I remember his voice shaking a little bit, and he just said, you're going to marry me. You're marrying me, right? Looking back at that very moment that he came here, It's like the darkness came in the door.
I was in horror. I couldn't speak. This is something that you would see on 2020. This doesn't happen to us.
He was brilliant, an evil brilliant.
Deborah Proctor's boyfriend Jeff has surprised her with an impromptu proposal.
I wanted to be married, and I was very happy about it. We just wanted a small, intimate ceremony in Eureka Springs, a couple of hours from here. His son, little Jeff, and daughter-in-law came. I was so happy to meet his family, just thrilled. At the time, Dustin, my oldest son, was living in Fort Worth, Dallas, and he just said they weren't able to make it. And so that was a bit painful to my heart. My youngest son, Derek, was there, and he walked me down. It was April 23rd, 2000 we married, and that was 2 years to the date that we'd actually met in person the first time. Jeff, he had the usual smile and seemed to enjoy and engage in the day. I just went right on like I would normally go, except now I had a partner and a husband to go with me. Immediately I went to work trying to help him get work, and a friend gave him a job, and he didn't keep that longer than 3 days. He came home and he just said that really wasn't what I was looking for, and I was like, oh, well, that's disappointing, but it's okay, something will work out.
In March 2004, Jeff redeems himself when he lands his best contract yet for a construction job at a prison in North Carolina.
I was very excited about it. I was just going to give up everything. I gave notice of 2 or 3 months.
It's a big step for Deborah, who is a hospital nurse and the director of a healthcare clinic. But just before she's ready to leave, she gets a call from Jeff.
And he said that there was another contractor. He got upset with Jeff over something and kind of approached him like he was going to hit him. And Jeff said, I told him, you're picking on the wrong guy. He said he didn't stop, so I took him out. He said, I broke his teeth. He said, Deb, there's no tolerance. It doesn't matter that he attacked me. There's just no tolerance. So he lost that job. This was a great job. I was moving out there. I'd already given notice. I was going to finish a different degree at Duke. I was pretty excited.
Deborah rescinds her notice, but it's hard to turn a blind eye to Jeff's violent outburst.
And at that point, I was like, I don't know. I think I'm just done. I can't. What is this work stuff? How can you mess this up? I talked to my closest friend, Katie. By this time, everyone liked Jeff. They just felt like, I needed to help pack him up and move him home, that there wasn't anything he could do if he was being attacked, that he warned the guy.
I mean, we just made excuses for him. That's what honest, loving people do, I think, that can't see evil in people. Deb can't see evil in people.
But the stressful ordeal takes a physical toll on Deborah.
And when we came back, I was just deathly ill. But I'm such a fighter and a push on, I just didn't pay attention. By the time we got home late morning, I was like, I can't breathe. You have to take me into the hospital. And of course, I was a nurse at the hospital at that time, so the crowds were gathering. Everyone was very concerned.
Everyone but Jeff, who goes home. Deborah is so sick with pneumonia that she's unaware he's left her side.
I ended up having to go on life support.
He was absent. He wasn't there. He never called. It was an hour by hour, is she going to make it? My husband would have been right there by my bedside.
I think it was 9 days and 6 or 7 on life support. My friends were just furious furious that he left me. When I kind of came around, they were all still very angry that he would just walk out not knowing if I was going to live or die.
Deb bounces back quickly and forgives Jeff for his absence, but her friends think she should walk away from the relationship.
I didn't feel like I was making excuses. I felt like they just didn't understand.
Over time, most of Deborah's friends forgive Jeff, who is suitably remorseful, and he finally settles into his new life in Oklahoma.
When he did locate employment, it was typically good. He might have to travel to Arkansas or Tulsa or Bartlesville from here, but, he made a good living at times.
But before long, another shoe drops.
Somehow, IRS bills arrived, and I was like, what's this about, Jeff? I didn't know you owed thousands of dollars to the IRS. You probably should have told me that. And he said, well, we're still fighting it. I was just angry. Here was this enormous tax bill that he didn't tell me he owed, but there wasn't any way around it. We had to pay it.
In January 2003, Deborah and Jeff finally receive welcome news. It's his mother Dot's 80th birthday, and they are invited to a party in Edmonton, Alberta.
He'd been in my life for 5 years, and I'd never met anybody in his family except little Jeff. So that's when we flew to Canada for the birthday party.
Jeff's Canadian family has a completely different surname, Stan, not Walton.
Jeff told me that he was born in Alaska. Sometime in grade school that they moved to Canada, and that's why his name was different. He had a different dad. But in 2003 when we went, just his mother was alive, and I met his sister Wendy. She's just got to be a great human. And then his brothers, 2 brothers, Alan and John.
Deborah is also about to meet a man named Dave Semple, a law enforcement officer who is attending the party for Dorothy Stan as well.
In 2003, my mother called and said that there was an 80th birthday party for Dot and suggested that I go up and represent the family. The birthday party was in an apartment building where his mother lived. By the time I got there and got out of my car and started walking towards the building, and I saw 2 guys walking towards me, and I saw that big toothy grin, but I recognized it right away. I said, Ronnie Stan, that's gotta be you. Well, hey, I was your closest friend back in 1947, and he recognized me then and gave me a great big bear hug. And that's when he said, I'm not Ronnie Stan, my name is Jeff Walton.
If Dave looks like he's seen a ghost, it's because the man who Dave Semple knew as Ronnie Stan died in a barn fire in 1977.
There was a bunch of pigs that were in the barn that died. The fire department and the OPP did an investigation. Everybody just assumed that he had died, and that the intense fire had just rendered everything right to dust.
Now Ronnie Stan has risen from the dead with a different name, Jeff Walton. But why is Jeff's family keeping Deborah in the dark?
Double lives are fascinating. We all wonder if we've met somebody who has some kind of secret life behind them.
I didn't want to see it. I thought he was a good guy.
3 years after marrying Jeff, Deborah Proctor finally meets his mom at her 80th birthday party in Canada.
I was so happy to meet his family, just thrilled. And we all just hit it off famously. Was happy to meet Dave, a childhood friend.
She is unaware that everyone at the party, including his family, knows Jeff by another name and are colluding to keep it from her. Jeff asks Dave not to tell Deborah, and he obliges out of loyalty.
I'd always called him Ron, and now all of a sudden to have to catch myself and call him Jeff, so I basically tried not to call him anything at all. There's a lot of questions running around in my head, but wasn't time to be asking anything at that point. I just sort of glad to see him again.
She's so delighted to meet Jeff's Canadian family, Deborah doesn't notice any awkwardness.
Had no idea. None. And they all called him Jeff.
His family. You stick together. They were just happy as heck to have him back. Made the family complete again. After talking to his mom and to his brothers and sisters on that very, very first night, I was satisfied that there was nothing that was, there was no wrongdoing. He had simply disappeared.
But the story of how Ronnie Stan became a fugitive and what crimes he may have committed while on the run is far from simple. What Jeff's friends and family know, and what Deborah won't find out for another 10 years, is that back in 1977, Ronnie Stan was married to a woman named Gail and had 2 children.
He was living in southwestern Ontario in the 1970s. He was working as a teacher at Fanshawe College. He also had a farm. So he was working on the farm at night, and by day he was teaching. He had become involved with a student. It's not good to be involved with a student at any time, but especially if you're married with children. This student told her mother that she was going to marry Ronald Stan. And her mother phoned his mother, and his mother told him, "You're in big trouble. She's from a very rich and powerful family." So on that day, his whole world was going to come apart. There just happened to be a fire which presented an opportunity. He's sitting there in the field and he can hear his wife screaming as she sees the barn burning, knowing that he was supposed to be in there feeding the pigs. He had $3,000 that was in his pocket, and under the cover of night, he hopped on a bus and crossed the border and decided to go to New Orleans.
Initially, Ron's family presumes that he died in the fire with the pigs and are unaware that he now adopts a new identity.
So Ron Stan decided to change his name to Jeff Walton. Jeff was after the son he abandoned in Ontario, and Walton was after the television show The Waltons because he thought it was a nice, friendly American family name. And in his words, he had to find someone with a little bit of money to marry, and the woman that he found was Roseanne. He described her as a beautiful young woman from a well-to-do family in New Orleans.
Jeff tells Roseanne his family died in a plane crash in Alaska. But when the two start talking marriage the following year, there's a snag.
Jeff Walton, he didn't have a birth certificate. So they went to another county where you didn't need a birth certificate to get a marriage license, and they got married there. And he was clearly still married to Gail, his Canadian wife.
He told me that he wound up getting married and having a child with her, little Jeff.
My first impression of Roseanne was she seemed like a very nice woman who had a very bad relationship with Jeff Walton. In her words, she said he could charm a snake. Roseanne got in some kind of a car accident with a commercial vehicle, and there was a lawsuit with a settlement of $500,000. Roseanne said that Jeff spent a lot of money on booze and women and partying in New Orleans.
He wound up divorcing her, and she said then he wound up marrying a Playboy bunny. And again, I figured, well, that's really, but that turned out to be true.
Jeff Walton's second wife, or Ron Stan's third wife, is Holly Kelly.
I was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Playboy came into town, and I wanted to get into Playboy. I thought it was very classy, and I didn't see anything wrong with it. They ended up taking about 5,000 pictures of me, which I always wondered what in the world happened to the negatives.
Holly's living in New Orleans in the 1990s when her friends say there is someone they'd like her to meet.
Jeff was charming. We hit it off great. He had everything that you could ever imagine, you know. I mean, he had the looks, he had the charm, he had money. You know, that helps.
Holly knows her new boyfriend Jeff is still technically married, but Jeff no longer lives with Roseanne and little Jeff. What Holly doesn't know is if he has any other living relatives, including other wives.
I know that Jeff started reaching out to his family in Canada in the early 90s. I don't know if they were actively searching for him. He had been declared dead.
In 1993, Jeff divorces Roseanne and marries Holly.
It was a beautiful, beautiful wedding, beautiful day. I did want to marry Jeff beyond a shadow of a doubt. I mean, I loved Jeff. I mean, he really was a great guy. None of us knew that he had just been lying about his entire life the whole time. I mean, we just totally fell for what he was telling us. He would do anything for me, except tell the truth. Yeah. He told my father that he was in Vietnam. I guess it was to impress my father, because my father was a Marine in World War II, Iwo Jima. You question yourself because you think, you know, am I nuts? He was very, very smart. He would cover it up somehow. Somehow he would make it believable.
And Holly did believe in Jeff until the day the phone rang and it was a call from Canada.
His brother called and said, you know, we've been looking for Jeff. And when he got home from work, hey, somebody called and said they were your family from Canada. And, you know, I mean, his face turned white as a sheet. And I thought maybe he murdered someone. What was so horrible that you would have to do this? It's just, no words.
In 1990, Jeff Walton's third wife, Holly Kelly, learns that everything he told her and her parents about his life is a lie.
I had to go tell my mother and father all of this, that this guy that they thought was Jeff Walton, his name's Ron Stan. The question is where do you take it from there? I knew at that point that it was over, and he did too.
More than 20 years later, his fourth wife, Deborah Proctor, remains ignorant of his past. But a lifetime of lies seems to be catching up with Jeff.
Jeff had had a number of hospitalizations. One was hemorrhaging, and they felt like he had bladder cancer, and I never left his side. And then he said, Deb, I'm not feeling right. My eyesight's really blurry. I'm not making sense with my words. And I took him in, and he had a stroke. So I was just trying to pay for everything.
On the verge of bankruptcy, Deborah asks Jeff to access his veterans' health benefits, but he refuses.
I said, you don't understand. We have nothing left. And that's when he informed me, I'm not going to the Veterans for Care. And besides that, I was in Special Forces. I did have a dishonorable discharge. And so they're not even going to have a list of me at the Veterans. They're not going to see me, and I'm not going anyway. And I remember at the time feeling like my throat was closing and my heart was heavy, and I thought, something's not right. It's just not right. I thought maybe I should get a private investigator. Anyway, I didn't. I do think it was about that time that I did go into what I would say is a severe depression. I was sad. I'd be somewhere in the house by myself, but just sobbing and crying and just saying, I hate my life. August 1st, 2014, I was just in my office and a phone rang, and I picked up this particular phone call. And he identified himself, his badge number, said he was in OPP, Ontario Provincial Police. He said, well, we have reason to believe that you're married to Ron Stan. We have reason to believe that he is a man that burned his place down. 37 years ago and left a newborn son and a toddler and a wife. I was in so much shock, disbelief. And when we hung up, I called my friends. They said, well, for God's sake, your life's probably in danger. We have to go out to the Cherokee Nation Marshal Service, and we have to get some help. So that's what we did.
She was really confused. This man that she had been with for at least 14, 15 years was possibly not the man he'd been saying he was. I contacted Canada. I spoke to a female officer, and she said, yes. We opened up cold cases, and we came across his and started working on it again.
The officer said they found him by examining the social media pages of his various family members.
And we were shocked that we actually found him on Facebook. They explained that the reason why he went missing was there was a barn fire. And apparently he was in the barn fire, but they never found any remains. The case just kind of sat for years because they had no clue, and nothing ever surfaced again. And they asked me at that time, they said, if you don't mind, could you interview him and see what he says? We're trying to figure out if this is him or not.
Shauna drives to the medical facility where Jeff is staying while he recovers from his stroke and meets him in a private room.
I proceeded on to explain to him that I had received a call from Canada police. So I eventually told him, I was like, do you at least have your birth certificate? Do you have your birth certificate so I can see? And he said, yes. And I said, well, where's it at? Well, I don't know. I can't remember where. And I said, well, that's okay. I said, I'll ask my dispatcher to get a copy of your birth certificate. And he looked at me. He just started grinning. He said, you got me, didn't you? And I said, you have kids and a wife in Canada? And he said, yes, I do. He was using a deceased individual's Social Security number and was getting Oklahoma benefits off the Social Security number for at least 20 years. He was a very good con. I felt so sorry for Deb once I got the confession from him.
Wasn't any getting around it. That was the truth. Just shocking. I didn't imagine anything like this. I couldn't talk to Jeff. What was I going to say? You're a liar? But, I had to plan. I mean, how am I going to tell my boys? How am I going to tell his boy?
She was very, very upset, and I could certainly understand why.
I was grateful for my friends, and we just started making plans. Well, we got to go to the bank. We got to get with your attorney. We were able to get a quick claim deed and a quick divorce, and our tribe's domestic violence program helped me. They helped serve the papers because I just couldn't do it.
Jeff Jr. agrees to take custody of his father.
I was just really angry. I was frightened at this point that, he might hurt us. Because now I'd learned he burned the place down.
It was just a nightmare, and you feel so stupid. The time I spent with him was not quality time, it was all fake time. I just hated him.
I'm at home alone in my bedroom when I got the call that they had left Tahlequah and they were on the road. People talk about spiritual awakenings or a burning bush moment or something. For me, it was absolutely that moment. And I realized I couldn't get up. I couldn't move. And then I thought, dear God, if you can just get me up on my feet, I will not only survive, but I will always remember to help others. Was just a profound understanding of what I'd been through and what I had yet to do.
I think it was a couple of days after that I had a conversation with Jeff. I think he was kind of somewhat relieved about the whole thing. coming out in the open after all these years.
An Ontario man who went missing in the 70s and was declared dead in the 80s has been found in the United States alive. Police say the 69-year-old has been living in Oklahoma under a different name.
Once it came out, it just snowballed.
Deborah is about to learn the full extent of Jeff's lies, and it makes her ordeal even more unbearable.
And that's when I learned about all the wives.
For 37 years, Ronald Stan has been living under a fake identity in the U.S. In 2014, the Ontario police issue a press release about the case.
This story landed on my desk, and it said a man named Ronald Stan, who was missing in 1977, has been found alive and well in the United States, which was a crazy story. Like, what happened there?
Tim Elemenchuk finds Jeff in New Orleans, where he is now living with his son Jeff Jr., and he agrees to an interview.
He had this kind of unmistakable charm that I could see disarming somebody. Every successive wife would eventually find out about his past, and his stories would just fall apart and wouldn't quite hang together. But he had this capacity to charm people off the hop and to get people to kind of not dig deeper into his history.
He just was a pathological liar. Only a narcissist person could do something like that, to make people think you're dead and to leave your children and never call them.
I don't think he was actually a very good liar, and that's evidenced by how his story fell apart along the way. And when you look into it and when you talk to people, his family knew that he was alive. His brother had contact with him on Facebook.
Even his Canadian wife, Gail, eventually found out about his lies in 1998 when he shows up at his dad's funeral.
He said that his wife was at the funeral and that she wouldn't even look at him. As far as I know, he never spoke with Gail again.
Ron had been declared legally dead in 1986, and Gail had received an insurance payout.
He explained to me later on that insurance money that his first wife had got, once he contacted her, she was quite PO'd about the whole thing and paid the money back to the insurance company. So there's no fraud or anything there.
His father's funeral may have been a time when he realized that he can't undo what he did in 1977. And so in reaction to that, that might have been what spurred looking for another new life.
Deborah never talks to Jeff again.
I was sitting in one of the airports and I saw that he was calling, and it just went to voicemail. And he said that he had forgiven me for everything I'd done to him. And at this point, I was just done. I just could hardly even react. I just couldn't stand him.
Months later, Deborah speaks to his old friend Dave Semple, who explains why he never told her the truth.
He just explained that, we had a good life, we seemed happy, and they just did not feel like it was their place to fly in here and tell me everything and destroy my life. I myself submitted letters to HHS, fraud, abuse. I think I wrote 3 different divisions of Medicare and Social Security and let them know who Jeff really was. And as far as I know, nobody ever pursued it.
Jeff never faces criminal charges for arson, identity theft, bigamy, or any of his misadventures. But his life goes downhill after his divorce from Deborah.
I don't know what happened there, but he wound up, I think, living almost a homeless life for a while. And then the next I heard from little Jeff, that I think it was 2019, that his dad had just passed away.
Jeff may have left behind a trail of damaged lives, but Deborah transcended his betrayal, although it took her some time.
I just went through a lot of periods of just being furious, angry, turned it on myself sometimes, how could you? And then resentful at all the best years of my life I spent with him. The job that I've moved into, it is the focus entirely, is domestic abuse, family abuse, particularly women, but families. I'm a director of a program that's our total focus. And I feel like it's fulfilling a commitment I made right after this happened, that I would always help others in this situation. Because we can go on to not only survive, we can live. And I feel like I live, not just a survivor, I live. That's what I would want for others.
No one remembers the exact moment the town stopped feeling safe, only that it happened quietly, without sirens or headlines, sometime between sunset and dawn, when the highway lights flickered and a body lay unseen beyond the shoulder of the road, hidden in plain sight by the vastness of Texas itself, a place where distances swallow secrets and silence can stretch for years. It began, as so many cold cases do, with absence, with a woman who did not come home, with a phone that rang unanswered, with a morning that arrived carrying unease instead of routine. She was supposed to be back before midnight. That much was certain. She had told a friend she was taking the long way home, avoiding construction, cutting through a familiar stretch of highway where the road ran flat and straight and empty, the kind of road where nothing ever happened, the kind of road where people stopped paying attention. When her car was found the next day, parked neatly at a rest stop miles away from her route, doors unlocked, keys missing, purse still inside, it felt wrong in a way that was impossible to articulate, but immediately understood by everyone who saw it. This was not forgetfulness. This was interruption. Texas, 2001. A community built on oil shifts and high school football, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your neighbors by name. News traveled fast, but understanding traveled slowly. The sheriff's office called it a missing person at first, a procedural classification that sounded calm and orderly, but beneath it ran panic, whispered through grocery aisles and church parking lots, through late-night phone calls that ended with the same question. Have you heard anything new? The answer was always no. The search began with optimism, with volunteers fanning out across fields and drainage ditches, with helicopters tracing the highway like a finger following a line on a map. Dogs were brought in. Flyers were taped to gas station windows. Every abandoned structure was checked, every stretch of brush pushed through. The Texas sun beating down, unforgiving, as if determined to erase footprints before anyone could follow them. Days passed, then weeks. The word missing started to feel less temporary, heavier each time it was spoken. When they found her, it was not where anyone expected. The call came in early, just after dawn, from a truck driver who had pulled over to check his load and noticed something off beyond the guardrail, something that did not belong to the landscape. By the time deputies arrived, the scene was already contaminated by curiosity, by fear, by the terrible human instinct to look. The body had been there long enough for the land to begin reclaiming it, long enough for answers to start slipping away. The news hit the town like a physical blow. This was no longer a disappearance. This was a homicide. The shift in language changed everything. Roads felt narrower. Familiar faces felt less familiar. Parents locked doors that had never been locked before. The idea that someone could vanish from a routine drive home and end up dead along a highway cracked something fundamental, something people had assumed was unbreakable. Investigators worked the scene with the urgency of those who knew time was already against them. There were no obvious witnesses, no nearby cameras, no clear signs of where she had been taken or why. The location where her body was found did not match the place she was last seen, or the rest stop where her car had been left, creating a puzzle with pieces scattered miles apart. This was not a crime of opportunity, they believed. It was deliberate, controlled. Someone had made decisions step by step, confident enough to believe they would never have to explain them. The autopsy confirmed what the town already feared. This was a violent death, sudden and intentional, but the details did little to narrow the suspect pool. No defensive wounds that pointed to a struggle in public. No clear timeline that could be reconstructed with certainty. Just fragments, incomplete and frustrating, like headlines torn from different newspapers and shuffled together. Suspects emerged quickly, then faded just as fast. A former boyfriend who had argued with her weeks earlier, cleared by alibi. A coworker who had offered to walk her to her car one night, his name lingering in rumors long after investigators moved on. A truck seen on the highway around the time she disappeared, described differently by each person who mentioned it. The case filled notebooks and filing cabinets, evidence logged and boxed, hope carefully labeled and stored. As months passed, the intensity cooled, replaced by a grinding persistence that wore down both detectives and the people waiting for answers. Leads dried up. Tips slowed to a trickle. The highway returned to its quiet rhythm, cars passing the spot without knowing why it felt heavy, why some locals avoided looking to the side as they drove by. The case slipped into that uncomfortable category law enforcement never likes to name out loud, the one that means unresolved, unfinished, unsatisfying. Years went by. New officers joined the department who had never met the victim but knew her name from training, from whispered warnings about the case that got away. Technology advanced. Databases grew. Evidence was retested, then retested again, each time with the same result. Nothing definitive. The file grew thicker even as the truth remained thin. For the family, time did not heal so much as stretch the pain into something dull and constant. Anniversaries came and went, marked by quiet gatherings and renewed pleas for information. They learned the language of cold cases, the careful optimism, the restrained disappointment, the phone calls that started with hope and ended with silence. The community moved on outwardly, but the story never fully left. It lingered in the background, a cautionary tale without a conclusion. Then, without warning, the case stirred. It did not happen with a press conference or a breakthrough forensic test. It happened on a roadside years later during a traffic stop so ordinary it barely registered as an event at all. A patrol car pulling over a vehicle for a minor violation. A conversation through a rolled-down window. A name run through a database out of habit more than expectation. Routine, procedural, forgettable. Until it wasn't. The name came back with a flag. Old. Buried. Tied to a case few still spoke about out loud. An officer stared at the screen, then at the driver, then back at the screen again, the weight of history pressing into a moment that had begun like any other shift. Somewhere, far from that stretch of road, a file long considered dormant seemed to inhale for the first time in years. What followed would take time to understand, layers to peel back, assumptions to challenge. A simple stop, a casual question would open a door no one had managed to pry open before, connecting dots that had never been placed on the same page. The past, it seemed, had been waiting patiently, confident that eventually, someone would look in exactly the right place. And as the patrol car's lights faded into the distance, the cold case that had haunted a Texas town since 2001 began quietly to wake up. The traffic stop itself lasted less than 5 minutes, the kind of encounter that usually dissolves into paperwork and forgetfulness, but something about it refused to settle, a residue of unease that followed the officer back into the cruiser, back into the glow of the dashboard screen where old records slept and rarely stirred. The flag was subtle, easy to miss, a thin line of text buried beneath more recent entries, but it carried a date that pulled the past forward with sudden force. Texas, 2001, homicide unsolved. The name on the license did not scream danger, did not come with warnings or alerts, just a quiet association that felt heavier than it should have, as if the system itself hesitated before displaying it. The driver had been calm, almost friendly, answering questions with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to authority, hands steady on the wheel, voice level, eyes meeting the officers without defiance or fear. Nothing about the interaction suggested guilt or menace, and yet, when the officer returned the documents and allowed the car to merge back onto the highway, the sense of normalcy felt artificial, like scenery painted over a crack in the wall. Routine, yes, but routines have a way of exposing what people forget to hide. Back at the station, the name resurfaced. Another officer recognized it, not from experience but from repetition, from briefings that referenced a case everyone knew by reputation, a file that lived in the building like a ghost, occasionally mentioned, never resolved. The connection was thin, circumstantial at best, but cold cases survive on thin threads. They endure on the possibility that one small deviation from normal might finally point somewhere new. The file was pulled from storage, its edges worn soft by time, its contents yellowed and heavy with the frustration of years. Inside were photographs that no longer shocked the way they once did. Reports written by hands that had since retired or passed on, timelines marked with question marks instead of conclusions. The suspect lists read like a map of dead ends, names circled, crossed out, annotated with notes that reflected hope at the time and resignation later. And there, buried among interviews and lab results, was the name from the traffic stop mentioned briefly, almost dismissively, cleared early due to lack of evidence, alibi unverified but accepted. In 2001, the investigation had been constrained by what it could see and what it could prove. Records were paper. Databases were fragmented. Connections required intuition and time, both in short supply during the frantic early days after a murder. A person could drift through a case without leaving fingerprints behind, could exist on the periphery without ever being pulled into the center. The name had done just that, brushed past suspicion and continued on, life uninterrupted, history incomplete. Now, years later, the landscape was different. Systems spoke to each other. Patterns emerged where once there had been noise. Investigators revisiting the case felt the familiar tension of reopening wounds, but also something else, a cautious anticipation that technology might succeed where memory had failed. The traffic stop was not evidence, not yet, but it was a reason to look again, and in cold cases, reasons are precious. They began with timelines, reconstructing the night piece by piece, aligning known movements with newly available data. Cell phone records, once impossible to retrieve, now existed in archived form, incomplete but suggestive. The victim's phone had gone silent at a specific window of time, a gap that had never been fully explained. The suspect's record showed activity that night too, calls that placed him closer to the highway than he had admitted in his original statement. Not proof but proximity, the kind that narrows possibilities. Interviews were revisited, old tapes digitized, voices from the past played again through modern speakers, their inflections analyzed, their pauses noted. In one interview, the suspect laughed at an odd moment, a detail dismissed years earlier as nervousness, now reconsidered under a harsher light. Another witness, once vague, now sounded deliberately evasive, their recollection shifting subtly between statements. Time had not clarified the truth, but it had preserved inconsistencies. As word spread quietly within the department, the case began to feel less dormant, less like history and more like something alive, waiting. Detectives who had not been born when the murder occurred now found themselves immersed in its details, reading reports as if they were chapters in a story that had been abandoned mid-sentence. They noticed things their predecessors had missed, not because they were better, but because distance allows perspective. Familiarity can blind as easily as ignorance. The suspect was brought in for a voluntary interview. He arrived without a lawyer, confident, cooperative, greeting officers by name as if this were an inconvenience rather than a threat. He spoke of the night in question with rehearsed clarity, repeating details that matched his original account almost perfectly, as though he had practiced them over the years. He denied knowing the victim beyond a passing acquaintance, denied being anywhere near the highway at the critical time, denied everything that mattered. His demeanor never cracked. But investigators had learned that lies do not always reveal themselves through nervousness or contradiction. Sometimes they hide inconsistency, in stories told too smoothly, in answers delivered before questions are fully formed. The interview ended without confrontation, without accusation, but it left behind a trail of notes and impressions that refused to align with innocence. Evidence long considered useless was re-examined. Fibers once dismissed as environmental contamination were compared against new databases. Soil samples taken from the scene were matched with locations tied to the suspect's employment at the time. The results did not shout, but they whispered, overlapping in ways that suggested the victim and the suspect had shared more space than either had acknowledged. Still, the case resisted resolution. For every new connection, there was an explanation. For every inconsistency, a plausible excuse. Prosecutors cautioned restraint, reminding detectives that suspicion is not proof, that cold cases collapse easily if pushed too hard without solid footing. The weight of the years worked against them. Memories faded, witnesses moved, evidence degraded. The margin for error was thin. Outside the station, the community remained largely unaware of the renewed activity. No headlines announced progress. No official statements promised justice. The family was informed cautiously, told that the case was being reviewed, that new information had surfaced, that hope was warranted but fragile. They listened with practiced restraint, having learned the cost of optimism too well. And yet something had changed. The investigation no longer felt like an exercise in obligation but a pursuit with direction, however uncertain. The routine traffic stop had done what years of deliberate effort had not. It had placed the past directly in the path of the present. The suspect continued his life, unaware of how closely it was now being observed, how every movement and record was being recontextualized against a crime he believed time had buried. The highway where the victim disappeared remained unchanged, asphalt stretching toward the horizon, indifferent to the stories layered beneath it. Cars passed at speed, drivers focused on destinations, never imagining that one ordinary stop, one minor violation, had begun to unravel a mystery that had endured for decades. The case was no longer asleep. It was alert, listening, waiting for the moment when coincidence hardened into certainty. And somewhere between archived files and glowing screens, the truth edged closer, still obscured, still dangerous, but no longer entirely out of reach. By the time investigators realized how much the case had shifted, the change had already settled into their routines, subtle but undeniable, shaping decisions, sharpening questions, turning every new detail into a potential hinge on which the entire story might swing. Cold cases do not announce their revival with certainty. They creep back into relevance, one anomaly at a time, demanding attention without promising reward. This one moved that way now, quietly insistent, pulling resources and focus as if it knew exactly how long it had waited. The suspect's past began to unfold under renewed scrutiny, not as a single narrative but as a constellation of moments, jobs, addresses, relationships, all pinned to maps and timelines, all examined for overlap with the victim's final hours. In 2001, he had been transient, moving between temporary work sites, leaving light footprints, the kind that rarely trigger alarms. Construction crews, delivery routes, late shifts that provided both explanation and cover. Back then, the fluidity of his life had worked in his favor. Now it created patterns. Investigators noticed how often his work had placed him near highways, rest stops, stretches of road similar to the one where the victim's car was found. He knew those places, understood their rhythms, the times when traffic thinned and anonymity thickened. He had reasons to be there that sounded legitimate, reasons that had passed unchallenged years earlier. The question was no longer whether he could have been present, but whether presence had ever been the whole story. Old witness statements took on new weight. A gas station clerk who remembered a man lingering near the restrooms that night, described vaguely, too vaguely to identify, now seemed less irrelevant. A motorist who recalled being followed briefly before losing sight of the car, a memory dismissed as coincidence, resurfaced with uncomfortable clarity. These accounts had not changed. The context around them had. Investigators returned to the rest stop where the victim's car had been left, standing in the same place as officers had stood years earlier, trying to see what they had missed. The layout explained choices that had once seemed random. The position of the vehicle suggested familiarity, not haste. The absence of obvious disturbance suggested control. Whoever left the car there did not panic. Panic leaves messes. This scene was almost tidy. The suspect was interviewed again. This time with less distance, more specificity. He answered as before, calm, measured, offering explanations that fit just well enough to resist collapse. When confronted with cell phone records, he shrugged, attributing them to work-related calls, forgotten errands. When asked about the rest stop, he smiled faintly, saying he used many along his routes, could not possibly remember each one. His confidence bordered on boredom, a man tired of revisiting a story he believed was already finished. But the investigators had learned to listen for what he did not say. He avoided certain details, spoke generally when pressed for specifics, leaned on the erosion of time as if it were an ally. In one moment, he corrected an officer on the layout of a road he claimed not to remember well. In another, he referenced a landmark near the highway before it had been mentioned. Small slips, easily explained, easily ignored unless you were looking for them. The forensic reanalysis continued in parallel, slower, methodical, less dramatic but no less critical. Advances in technology allowed evidence once considered inert to be questioned again. Trace materials from the victim's clothing were compared against samples tied to the suspect's known locations. The matches were not definitive, but they were consistent enough to suggest contact, enough to justify deeper testing. Each result arrived without fanfare, a quiet increment in a growing column labeled possibility. Prosecutors remained cautious. They had seen cases like this unravel under the weight of expectation. Juries unconvinced by circumstantial webs spun too late. The burden was not just to suggest what might have happened, but to demonstrate it beyond doubt, to bridge decades with proof that could survive attack. They asked for patience. They asked for more. As investigators dug, the suspect's life showed signs of strain. He was not under arrest, not charged, but scrutiny has a gravity of its own. Friends noticed his irritability, his sudden interest in legal advice, his questions about statutes of limitations. He began revisiting old routines, frequenting places he had once avoided, as if trying to reassert normalcy through repetition. Surveillance captured these movements, mundane on the surface, meaningful in aggregate. The family, kept informed in measured updates, sensed the shift without fully trusting it. They had learned to read tone, to distinguish procedural optimism from genuine momentum. This felt different, they admitted quietly, not because answers were close but because the questions were sharper. The silence that had defined their grief was no longer absolute. It was punctured by possibility. Publicly, nothing had changed. The town continued its rhythms, unaware that its most enduring mystery was being reconstructed piece by piece. The highway remained anonymous, the rest stop unremarkable. Yet beneath that ordinariness, the case pressed forward, propelled by a convergence of chance and persistence that could not be undone. Then came the discovery that tightened everything. A financial record, overlooked in the original investigation, resurfaced during a comprehensive review. A transaction placed the suspect near the rest stop within a window he had denied being there. A small purchase, insignificant on its own, devastating in context. It was not enough to prove murder. It was enough to prove a lie. Investigators did not celebrate. Lies complicate cases as often as they clarify them, but this one mattered. It shifted leverage. It reframed interviews. It transformed hypothetical proximity into documented presence. The suspect was confronted again, this time with evidence he could not easily dismiss. His responses slowed. His confidence thinned. For the first time, the room felt uneven. The interview ended without a confession, without resolution, but with something new lingering in the air, a sense that the balance had tilted. The cold case, once defined by absence, now carried weight, substance, direction. The routine traffic stop that had started it all felt less like coincidence and more like inevitability, as if the story had always been moving toward this point, waiting for the right interruption. The truth was still incomplete, still contested, but it was no longer theoretical. It had shape. It had edges, and it was closing in. The lie changed the temperature of the room long after the interview ended, lingering like heat trapped in concrete, impossible to ignore, impossible to dissipate. Investigators replayed the moment again and again, watching the suspect's face as the financial record was placed in front of him, noting the fraction of a second where his certainty wavered, where calculation replaced ease. It was subtle, but subtlety is where cold cases live. A single proven falsehood does not solve a murder, but it redraws the map. It tells you where not to trust the roads you thought you knew. From that point on, every prior statement was reclassified. No longer testimony but material, something to be tested, weighed, stressed until it revealed fractures. The suspect's timeline, once accepted as a given, was dismantled and rebuilt in fragments. Investigators aligned his movements with traffic patterns, fuel purchases, work logs, any data point that could anchor him to a place in time. The picture that emerged was incomplete but increasingly uncomfortable, a silhouette that matched too well to be coincidence. They returned to the physical evidence with renewed purpose, this time guided by direction rather than desperation. Items that had sat untouched for years were handled again, photographed under new light, scanned with technologies that did not exist when the case was young. What had once been catalogued and forgotten now demanded explanation. Why was this here? How did that get there? Questions that had been asked before, yes, but not like this, not with a suspect whose story had begun to unravel. One particular detail, overlooked for its ordinariness, gained prominence. The The victim's car, found clean, almost sterile, had always bothered investigators. Vehicles tell stories even when cleaned. They retain traces of last moments of panic, of haste. This one had not. The absence suggested time, control, familiarity. Whoever left it there had not been in a rush. They had been deliberate, comfortable enough to wipe away presence without drawing attention. The suspect, with his work history and access to supplies, fit that profile in a way others did not. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses, once too grainy to be useful, was reprocessed, enhanced just enough to extract movement if not identity. A figure appeared near the rest stop around the critical window, height and build consistent with the suspect, clothing indistinct but posture familiar to those who had spent hours watching him on interview tapes. It was not the kind of image that wins cases in court. It was the kind that narrows them. Pressure mounted quietly. Detectives avoided leaks, avoided public statements, aware that expectation could poison progress. The suspect sensed the shift anyway. He began declining voluntary interviews, routing communication through an attorney, signaling a transition from cooperation to defense. It was his right, but it was also a line drawn, an acknowledgement that the past was no longer safely behind him. The family was brought in, seated in a room that had hosted too many similar conversations, and told that investigators believed they were closer than ever. No promises were made. None were needed. The weight in the room came from the possibility alone, from the idea that the years of waiting might not end in silence. They listened, asked careful questions, learned which details could be shared and which could not. When they left, hope followed them out, tentative and fragile but present. As the case tightened, old acquaintances of the suspect resurfaced, some voluntarily, others reluctantly, drawn by the sense that something long dormant was stirring. One remembered a conversation from years ago, a remark made in passing about highways and rest stops, about how easy it was for people to disappear in places like that. Another recalled a night when the suspect had returned home later than usual, agitated, smelling faintly of cleaning chemicals, an observation dismissed at the time as work-related. Memories are unreliable, especially after decades, but patterns emerge when enough of them align. Investigators understood the risk. Memory reshapes itself to fit narratives, especially when those narratives promise closure. They corroborated everything, cross-checked accounts against records, sought consistency rather than drama. Some recollections fell apart under scrutiny. Others held stubbornly intact, resistant to erosion. Each surviving detail added weight to the same conclusion. The suspect's proximity to the crime was no longer theoretical. The legal strategy evolved accordingly. Prosecutors debated timing, weighing the strength of circumstantial evidence against the vulnerabilities of an old case. They discussed grand jury options, the possibility of compelling testimony, the gamble of moving forward without the one thing everyone wanted and no one had, a confession. Cold cases rarely deliver clean endings. They demand decisions made under uncertainty. Meanwhile, the suspect adjusted. He sold his vehicle, changed routines, distanced himself from anyone who might talk. Surveillance noted these shifts without interpretation, logging behavior, resisting the urge to assign meaning too quickly. Guilt can look like caution. Innocence can look like fear. The line between them is thinner than most people believe. The highway remained unchanged, indifferent to the drama unfolding around it. Traffic flowed. Rest stops filled and emptied. The spot where the victim had last been free of her fate blended seamlessly into the landscape, its significance invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. That invisibility had protected the truth for years. Now it felt like a countdown. Late one evening, as investigators reviewed the accumulated material, a realization settled over the room, not sudden but inevitable. They had reached the edge of what patience alone could deliver. The case would not solve itself through incremental progress anymore. It required a move, a risk, a decision that would either force the truth into the open or collapse the fragile structure they had built. They prepared accordingly, drafting warrants, outlining arguments, anticipating defenses. Every step was deliberate. Every choice weighed against the cost of failure. This was not just about closing a file. It was about confronting the possibility that justice delayed might still be justice denied if they hesitated too long. As the night wore on, the case felt closer than it ever had, not to resolution but to reckoning. The lie that had surfaced during a routine traffic stop had grown into a fault line running through years of denial and omission. Whether it would finally break the case open or swallow it whole remained uncertain. But one thing was clear. The silence that had protected the crime since 2001 was cracking, and once silence breaks, it rarely stops at a single sound. The warrants moved quietly, deliberately, like pieces sliding into place on a board no one outside the room could see. There were no flashing lights, no dramatic knock in the night, only paperwork stamped and signed, language precise enough to survive scrutiny, authority granted not on certainty but on accumulation. Decades of fragments had finally added up to momentum. Investigators understood the risk. Once crossed, this line could not be uncrossed. The first search focused on what time had not erased. Storage units, old properties, vehicles long sold but once registered in the suspect's name. It was a reach, some said, a gesture more symbolic than practical. But cold cases are solved by reaching, by refusing to accept that years automatically equal loss. In one unit, beneath layers of unrelated debris, they found items that did not belong to the present, objects preserved not by intention but by neglect. Nothing illegal on its face. Nothing dramatic. Just remnants that should not have mattered and yet did. Among them were cleaning supplies consistent with those sold near the rest stop in 2001, brands discontinued, receipts tucked into a box like bookmarks in a forgotten book. Investigators did not leap to conclusions. Supplies are common. Receipts accumulate. But context transforms the mundane. These items aligned with timelines, with witness recollections, with the sterile condition of the victim's car. The coincidence began to feel engineered. Digital forensics followed, peeling back layers of the suspect's online life, sparse in the early years, richer later. Search histories revealed interests that circled the crime without naming it, queries about evidence persistence, about how long biological traces remained detectable, about legal thresholds in homicide cases. Individually, they meant little. Together, they suggested preoccupation, a mind returning repeatedly to the same unresolved problem. The suspect's attorney pushed back, publicly measured, privately aggressive, challenging scope, relevance, intent. Prosecutors anticipated this. Every move had been designed to withstand resistance, to demonstrate that this was not a fishing expedition but the continuation of a long-documented inquiry. Still, the tension rose. The case had entered a phase where mistakes could be fatal. Investigators re-interviewed witnesses one more time, not to extract new stories but to test old ones against the evolving framework. Some broke under pressure, admitting exaggerations, misremembered details, the human urge to matter in a story larger than oneself. Others remained consistent, their accounts unchanged despite years of distance. These were the voices investigators trusted most, not because they were dramatic but because they were stubborn. One witness, overlooked before for seeming too ordinary, provided a detail that finally clicked into place. He remembered seeing the suspect's vehicle near the highway late that night. Not stopped, not speeding but idling, lights off, an unusual choice on an otherwise empty road. At the time it had felt insignificant. Now it aligned perfectly with everything else. Control, patience, familiarity. The suspect was brought in again, this time under a different tone. Not accusatory, not confrontational but relentless. Questions were narrower now, answers harder to evade. Each denial was met with documentation. Each deflection circled back. The room felt smaller. The past pressed closer. For hours the suspect held his line, repeating versions of the same explanations, voice steady, posture unchanged. Then fatigue crept in, not dramatic, not explosive but visible. Answers slowed. Details blurred. At one point, he corrected himself mid-sentence, replacing a phrase with another that placed him closer to the scene than he had ever admitted. The mistake hung in the air. Investigators did not pounce. They waited. Silence, used carefully, is often more effective than accusation. The interview ended without a confession again, but it ended differently. The suspect left knowing the ground beneath him was unstable. Investigators watched him go, aware that pressure alone might never be enough. Some people carry their secrets too long to surrender them willingly. Behind closed doors, the question became unavoidable. Was this enough? Enough to arrest? Enough to charge? Enough to risk a trial built on circumstantial scaffolding? Prosecutors weighed the cost of waiting against the cost of acting. Evidence degrades. Witnesses disappear. But premature action can lock the truth away forever. As deliberations continued, the community began to sense movement. Rumors surfaced. Old conversations resurfaced with them. The case returned to dinner tables and late-night discussions, no longer as a cautionary tale but as an active wound reopening. The family felt it too. The shift in tone when officials spoke, the careful phrasing that suggested inevitability rather than hope. The decision came without ceremony. Charges would be filed. Not because the case was perfect, but because it was strong enough, because waiting promised no miracles, because justice delayed another year risked becoming justice denied entirely. The suspect was taken into custody quietly, without spectacle. His arrest recorded not as a victory but as a step. As he was processed, fingerprints taken, photographs logged, the weight of the moment settled unevenly. Relief mixed with dread. Satisfaction with fear. Cold cases do not end cleanly. They transition from investigation to judgment, from mystery to contest. The highway remained unchanged, indifferent to the turning of legal gears. But the silence around the crime was gone now, replaced by voices, arguments, headlines waiting to be written. A routine traffic stop had cracked the surface. What lay beneath was finally exposed to light. Whether that light would reveal the full truth or cast new shadows was no longer a question for investigators alone. The case had crossed into its final, most dangerous phase. The arrest did not bring relief the way people imagine it does. It brought noise. Phones rang. Doors closed harder than usual. Every conversation felt provisional, as if everyone involved understood that this moment, however long it had taken to reach, was not an ending but an opening into something far more volatile. The suspect sat in a holding cell built for short stays, staring at walls that had absorbed countless confessions and denials, offering neither comfort nor judgment. Outside, the case changed shape again, transforming from investigation to confrontation. Prosecutors moved with measured urgency, filing charges that reflected what they could prove, not what they believed. The language was careful, stripped of drama, built to survive challenge. Motive was implied but not overstated. Opportunity was documented. Presence was anchored. Lies were cataloged. The story they prepared was not cinematic. It was structural, a framework designed to hold under pressure. Defense responded in kind, swift and confident, attacking the age of the case, the fragility of memory, the danger of hindsight. They called it a narrative stitched together by coincidence and modern technology, a retroactive certainty imposed on a past that had resisted explanation for decades. They promised to expose bias, to show how desperation can masquerade as diligence when a case grows old enough to embarrass those who failed it the first time. The courtroom became the new arena, colder than the roadside, harsher than the interview room. Evidence that had felt persuasive in isolation now faced scrutiny measured in seconds and syllables. Every exhibit carried a question mark. Every witness carried a risk. Prosecutors rehearsed endlessly, aware that a single misstep could fracture the case beyond repair. Pretrial hearings stretched on, each one peeling back another layer of the story for public view. The community watched from a distance, learning details they had never known, reinterpreting memories through the lens of accusation. The victim's name returned to headlines, no longer followed by the word missing, but by charged phrases that promised accountability without guaranteeing it. For the family, this visibility was both validation and burden, grief refracted through speculation. The defense targeted the traffic stop relentlessly, framing it as arbitrary, a random encounter inflated into destiny. They questioned the reliability of database flags, the assumptions layered onto a routine interaction. They argued that the stop proved nothing, that coincidence had been mistaken for causation. Prosecutors countered not by elevating the stop, but by contextualizing it, presenting it as a spark, not the fire, the moment that reopened a door investigators had never truly closed. Witnesses took the stand, some hesitant, others resolute. Old recollections were challenged, timelines compressed, details contested. One by one, the pieces were placed before the court, not as a single revelation but as an accumulation, a pattern emerging from repetition rather than shock. The suspect watched, expression controlled, eyes fixed ahead, reacting only when names from his past were spoken aloud. Expert testimony filled the gaps time had carved. Analysts explained how technology had evolved, how data once unreachable had become accessible, how consistency across independent sources reduced the likelihood of coincidence. The defense responded with its own experts, emphasizing margins of error, alternative explanations, the danger of overinterpretation. The courtroom absorbed it all, dense and technical, a slow grind rather than a dramatic turn. Behind the scenes, negotiations surfaced and dissolved. Plea discussions hovered briefly, then vanished, replaced by hardened positions. The suspect maintained his innocence, rejecting any admission that would define him forever. Prosecutors weighed the offer they could make against the justice they sought, knowing that compromise might secure certainty but erase truth. They chose to proceed. As the trial approached, pressure intensified. Media interest grew. Commentators speculated. Armchair analysts reconstructed the case from fragments, confident in conclusions they had not earned. Investigators avoided the noise, focusing on preparation, reminding themselves that certainty outside the courtroom means nothing inside it. The victim's final day was reconstructed in neutral language, stripped of emotion by necessity. Movements, times, locations, each element presented without embellishment, trusting the weight of fact to carry its own gravity. The absence of her voice loomed largest, a silence no argument could fill. The defense closed ranks, painting a picture of a man pursued by circumstance, ensnared by a system eager to correct its past failures. They argued that the case was less about evidence than about closure, that someone had been chosen to carry the burden of unresolved grief. It was a compelling narrative, familiar, effective. The prosecution responded by narrowing focus, returning again and again to what could not be explained away. Documented presence, proven lies, converging timelines. They avoided rhetoric. They let repetition do the work. Patterns, they argued, are not accidents. As arguments sharpened, the courtroom felt smaller, air heavier, every word amplified by the knowledge that decades of waiting had distilled into this exchange. The jury listened, notebooks filling, faces unreadable. Outside, the highway carried on, indifferent, unchanged, unaware that its anonymity had been challenged in a room miles away. When the judge called for recess, the case paused but did not rest. It hung suspended, balanced between history and outcome, the product of a routine stop that had refused to remain routine. Whatever the verdict would be, the case had already altered something fundamental. Silence had been replaced by scrutiny, absence by confrontation. The cold case had entered its final stretch, not toward certainty but toward judgment, where truth must compete with doubt and only one is allowed to stand. When the trial resumed, the courtroom felt altered, not by anything visible, but by accumulation, the slow layering of testimony and argument that had begun to bend perceptions, to pull certainty and doubt closer together until the space between them felt uncomfortably narrow. Jurors settled into their seats with the weight of responsibility pressing harder now, aware that the story they were hearing was no longer abstract, no longer historical, but active, alive, demanding resolution. The prosecution shifted tone, not escalating, not dramatizing but tightening. They returned to sequence, to order, to the quiet authority of chronology. This happened, then this, then this. Each step anchored by something tangible. A timestamp, a receipt, a call log, a witness who remembered not because they wanted to help, but because the memory had never left. The narrative moved forward without flourish, confident that restraint would make it stronger. They lingered on the night itself, not reconstructing emotions, not speculating about fear or intent, but mapping movement. The victim's last confirmed sighting. The narrowing window where she vanished from all reliable contact. The suspect's documented presence within that same window, closer than he had ever admitted, closer than coincidence could comfortably explain. The jury followed along, pens moving, eyes flicking between exhibits and the faces of those presenting them. The defense countered with erosion. They attacked the integrity of timelines, pointing out gaps, inconsistencies, the unavoidable fuzziness that creeps into any account stretched across decades. They emphasized what was missing. No direct witness to the crime, no confession, no single piece of evidence that stood alone and declared guilt. They reminded the jury that patterns can be imposed, that human minds seek order even where none exists. Cross-examinations grew sharper. Witnesses were pressed on details they could not fully recall, moments that had blurred with time. Some faltered, their uncertainty exposed under the bright insistence of questioning. Others held firm, not because their memories were perfect but because they had never changed. The contrast mattered. One witness, a former co-worker of the suspect, shifted the room almost imperceptibly. He spoke without anger, without agenda, recounting a conversation from years earlier that had always unsettled him, a remark about how easy it was to control a situation if you chose the right place and time. At the time it had sounded like bravado, idle talk. In context it landed differently. The defense objected, arguing relevance. The judge allowed it, narrowly, carefully. The words remained. The suspect listened, expression fixed, jaw set. He did not react when his own past was laid out in pieces, when his movements were traced across maps and screens. Only once did his posture shift, a subtle straightening when the traffic stop was mentioned again, not as a turning point, but as an interruption, a moment that disrupted a long, careful distance from the past. It was brief. Most missed it. Expert testimony returned, reinforcing earlier points, not introducing new revelations but solidifying foundations. Analysts explained how independent data sources converged, how the probability of random overlap diminished as points aligned. The defense challenged methodology, suggested alternative interpretations, raised the specter of confirmation bias. The exchange was technical, dense, demanding attention rather than emotion. As days passed, fatigue crept in, not just among jurors but among those who had lived with the case for years. Investigators sat through testimony they knew by heart, hearing their own work dissected, aware that every decision they had made would now be judged by strangers. The family endured the process with quiet endurance, their grief suspended between hope and the fear of disappointment. Closing arguments approached like weather, inevitable, heavy with consequence. Prosecutors refined their message, stripping it to essentials. This was not about perfection, they emphasized. It was about truth assembled from reality, imperfect but consistent. They asked the jury not to search for a single moment of certainty, but to consider whether all reasonable alternatives had truly survived the evidence presented. The defense prepared a different appeal, one rooted in caution. They warned against the temptation to resolve discomfort with a verdict, against allowing the age of a case to lower the standard of proof. They framed doubt as protection, not obstacle, a safeguard against irreversible error. Their tone was calm, persuasive, grounded in principle rather than attack. When the day came, the courtroom filled early. Closing arguments unfolded without interruption, each side delivering exactly what it had promised. No surprises, no theatrics, just competing visions of the same facts, each asking the jury to trust a different instinct, one toward connection, the other toward restraint. The judge's instructions followed, precise and unemotional, outlining burdens and definitions, reminding jurors of their role not as historians or healers, but as arbiters of proof. Then the jury was dismissed to deliberate, disappearing behind a door that closed with a sound far louder than its mechanics suggested. Waiting resumed, a familiar state for everyone involved. Hours stretched. Conversations stalled. The past pressed close again, as it always does when the future is uncertain. Outside, traffic moved along the highway, indifferent to the gravity unfolding nearby. Drivers unaware that a story decades in the making was balanced on the collective judgment of 12 people in a quiet room. Inside that room, evidence was revisited, arguments replayed, doubts voiced and challenged. No one knew how long it would take. No one knew which interpretation would prevail. What was certain was that the cold case, once defined by silence and absence, now demanded a decision, one that would echo far beyond the walls that contained it. The reckoning had arrived. Deliberation stripped the case of voices, of ceremony, of performance, leaving only fragments on a table and 12 minds tasked with deciding what those fragments meant when assembled without guidance. Inside the jury room, the story lost its polish. Timelines were redrawn by hand, exhibits passed from one person to another, fingerprints smudging plastic sleeves, pens tapping against paper in rhythms that betrayed uncertainty. The weight of years pressed inward, not as history but as consequence. Some jurors gravitated immediately toward pattern, toward the sense that coincidence had been stretched too far to remain coincidence. They pointed to overlap, to lies that could not be explained by forgetfulness, to presence that had been denied and then documented. Others resisted, clinging to the absence of a single irrefutable moment, the missing piece that would silence doubt rather than argue with it. They spoke of caution, of how easily narratives solidify once a suspect is named. Hours passed. The room warmed. Voices sharpened, then softened. The case revealed its true difficulty here, not in complexity but in restraint. No one disputed that something terrible had happened. The argument was whether the law could claim certainty after so much time had intervened, after memories had faded and evidence had aged into suggestion. They returned again and again to the lie. Not the biggest lie but the provable one. The financial record. The documented presence where absence had been asserted. Some jurors saw it as pivotal, a fracture that exposed everything beneath it. Others saw it as human error magnified by pressure, a single misstatement inflated into implication. The room divided along that fault line. When frustration peaked, the foreperson called for silence. They reviewed instructions, reminded themselves of standards, of reasonable doubt as a threshold, not an escape. They asked not whether another explanation was possible, but whether it was reasonable given what they had heard. The question hung, uncomfortable, demanding honesty rather than comfort. Outside, the wait resumed its familiar cruelty. The family sat together, saying little, every glance loaded with meaning. Investigators lingered nearby, careful not to speculate, knowing that control had passed out of their hands. The suspect waited in a room that felt smaller than any cell, surrounded by counsel, eyes fixed on nothing in particular, his future suspended by voices he could not hear. The verdict, when it came, did not announce itself with drama. A knock. A word. Movement. The courtroom filled again, tension thick enough to taste. Jurors filed in, faces closed, expressions unreadable. The paper in the foreperson's hand seemed heavier than its weight allowed. The decision was delivered plainly, without flourish. Guilty on the count presented. Not every question answered. Not every doubt erased. But enough. Enough for the law. Enough to draw a line where there had been none for decades. Reaction rippled unevenly. The family exhaled, some collapsing inward, others staring ahead, absorbing the finality of a word that did not bring back what had been lost. Investigators felt something like release, tempered by exhaustion, aware that a verdict is not vindication, only resolution. The suspect absorbed the outcome in silence, expression tightening briefly before settling again into control. Sentencing loomed, another phase, another weight. Statements were prepared, words chosen carefully, grief translated into language that could be spoken aloud in a room full of strangers. The defense signaled intent to appeal, invoking procedure, precedent, the enduring vulnerability of circumstantial cases. The legal process, it seemed, was not finished speaking. As the courtroom emptied, the case shed another layer, transitioning once more, this time from question to record. Headlines would follow, simplified, declarative, offering closure in fonts too large for nuance. The community would react, some relieved, some skeptical, some unwilling to believe that a story so long unresolved could end without a final revelation. The highway remained unchanged, asphalt stretching on, indifferent to verdicts and grief. Cars passed the rest stop without slowing, unaware that its anonymity had once concealed a crime and now concealed its aftermath. The routine traffic stop that had cracked the case open receded into footnote status, its ordinariness restored by repetition. Yet beneath that ordinariness, something irreversible had occurred. The cold case was no longer cold. It had been named, judged, fixed in the public record. Whether truth and justice had aligned perfectly was a question that would persist, debated in quiet conversations and late-night doubts. What remained was the echo, the sense that resolution does not erase mystery, it only reshapes it. The verdict closed a chapter, but it did not silence the past. It left behind a story marked by coincidence and persistence, by routine moments that carried extraordinary consequence, by the unsettling idea that answers can arrive not through revelation, but through interruption. And even as the system moved on, filing the case under resolved, the unease lingered, a reminder that some truths reveal themselves slowly, reluctantly, and never without cost. Sentencing day arrived without ceremony, without the sharp tension of deliberation. carrying instead a heavier, quieter gravity, the kind that settles into the room before anyone speaks. The courtroom filled again, but the energy had shifted. This was no longer about whether the past would be acknowledged. It was about how it would be weighed. Justice, once abstract, now had a number attached to it, measured in years in calendars that would turn without mercy. The judge listened to statements with practiced stillness. The prosecution spoke first, not revisiting the evidence, not re-arguing guilt, but reframing impact. They spoke of time stolen, of a life interrupted and never resumed, of a family forced to age alongside uncertainty. Their words were restrained, deliberate, aware that excess would cheapen what could never be repaid. They asked for a sentence that reflected not outrage but permanence. Then the family spoke. Grief, when given structure, does not become smaller. It becomes sharper. Each sentence carried years of silence behind it, moments unmarked, celebrations hollowed out by absence. They did not demand vengeance. They did not raise voices. They described what it meant to live inside a question for decades, to measure time not by milestones, but by anniversaries of loss. The courtroom listened without interruption. Even the air seemed to pause. The defense followed, appealing to mitigation, to the weight of age, to the argument that a life defined by one crime should not be erased entirely. They spoke of complexity, of ambiguity, of the danger of transforming punishment into symbolism. They acknowledged harm without conceding moral finality, a delicate balance designed to humanize without absolving. The suspect was given the opportunity to speak. He stood slowly, hands resting on the lectern, posture controlled. His words were careful, limited, offering sympathy without admission, sorrow without responsibility. He spoke of regret for pain caused, of respect for the process, of hope for understanding. It was not a confession. It was not defiance. It was something in between, and for many in the room that was the most unsettling part. The sentence was delivered with clarity, lengthy, unambiguous, enough to ensure that freedom as he had known it would not return. The gavel fell softly, the sound swallowed by the room. There was no outburst, no visible collapse. Just a collective recognition that something irreversible had been declared. Appeals were filed as expected. Motions drafted, arguments preserved. The case entered yet another phase, quieter but no less consequential, shifting from witness stands to written briefs, from spoken testimony to legal interpretation. Years might pass before the final word was spoken. Finality, it seemed, remained elusive. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited, microphones extended, questions reduced to sound bites. Investigators declined comment beyond prepared statements. The family offered none. The story, once buried, now circulated freely, shaped by headlines and opinion, simplified into a narrative that could be consumed and moved past. But for those closest to it, moving past was not an option. The community absorbed the outcome unevenly. Some felt relief, a sense that the long shadow had finally lifted. Others felt discomfort, troubled by how a routine moment had unraveled into something so consequential, by the idea that certainty had arrived late and imperfect. Conversations surfaced in familiar places, repeating the same question in different forms. Was this truly the end? The highway answered nothing. It continued to carry travelers forward, unchanged, indifferent to memory. The rest stop was renovated, repainted, its past buried beneath fresh signage and fluorescent light. Only those who knew where to look felt the residue, the faint awareness that ordinary places can hold extraordinary weight. The file was marked closed, shelved differently this time, not forgotten but finalized. Investigators moved on to new cases, though some carried the old one with them, a reminder that patience and chance can intersect in ways no strategy can predict. The traffic stop that began it all became a lesson passed quietly to younger officers. Routine is an illusion. In the years that followed, the case resurfaced periodically, in appeals, in documentaries, in late-night discussions that revisited evidence with the confidence of distance. Each retelling altered it slightly, emphasizing different truths, different doubts. The original uncertainty never fully vanished. It simply changed shape. What remained undeniable was impact. A disappearance that had once fractured a town had finally been named, judged, answered in the only way the system allows. Whether that answer was complete was a question left to individuals, to conscience, to time. As the legal machinery continued its slow rotation, one fact endured beneath every argument and interpretation. A life had ended violently. A silence had lasted too long. And when it finally broke, it did so not with revelation, but with persistence, with a single interruption on a quiet road that refused to stay insignificant. The cold case had reached its conclusion on paper. In memory it remained unresolved, echoing softly, a reminder that justice, once delayed, never arrives untouched. Time did what it always does after a verdict. It moved forward without asking permission, carrying the case with it into a quieter, more ambiguous phase where certainty blurred and meaning fractured into interpretation. The appeals process unfolded in written arguments and closed hearings, far from cameras and public emotion, a procedural afterlife where the case was reduced to paragraphs, citations, and footnotes. Each filing reopened wounds in subtler ways, not through testimony, but through implication, suggesting that what had been decided might still be undone. The defense argued methodically, challenging the foundations rather than the conclusion. They questioned admissibility, the framing of expert testimony, the influence of cumulative evidence in a case defined by absence. They warned of precedent, of how old cases resurrected by modern tools risked reshaping standards retroactively. It was not an argument of innocence so much as one of process, a reminder that justice depends as much on how conclusions are reached as on what they declare. Prosecutors responded with equal precision, defending the integrity of the investigation, the independence of data sources, the jury's role in weighing doubt. They emphasized restraint, how the case had been built incrementally, not rushed, how each decision had been documented, reviewed, justified. They framed the verdict not as correction, but as culmination, the result of persistence rather than pressure. Months passed, then years. The appeals court ruled, affirming the conviction, rejecting claims of procedural error, noting that the age of a case does not immunize it from accountability. The language was formal, unemotional, yet final in a way that carried weight. Another door closed. Another layer settled. For the family, the ruling brought a different kind of quiet, not relief, not joy, but the absence of anticipation. The case would no longer intrude unexpectedly, no longer demand preparation for hearings that reopened grief. They learned to live without the constant hum of uncertainty, though the loss itself remained unchanged, as sharp as ever, simply no longer accompanied by questions that demanded answers. The suspect was transferred to a long-term facility, his life reorganized into routines dictated by others. In interviews conducted years later, he maintained his innocence, speaking calmly, consistently, as he always had. He referenced the traffic stop occasionally, calling it fate, coincidence, an unfortunate alignment of chance and suspicion. His words found audiences willing to listen, willing to doubt, willing to believe that truth can be misread when time stretches too long. Documentaries followed. Podcasts dissected every step, every exhibit, every hesitation in the jury room reconstructed by speculation. The case became content, a narrative shaped by pacing and tone, by what sounded compelling rather than what had been proven. Listeners debated details with confidence born of distance, arguing guilt and innocence as intellectual exercises, detached from consequence. Investigators watched this evolution with mixed feelings. They recognized the value of attention, of public interest and accountability, but bristled at simplification, at how years of careful work were compressed into episodes and headlines. Some spoke publicly, others declined, carrying their certainty quietly, knowing that proof satisfies courts more readily than audiences. The highway appeared in these retellings often, filmed at dawn or dusk, empty, symbolic, stripped of context. It became shorthand for chance, for anonymity, for how easily lives intersect without consequence until they do. The routine traffic stop was elevated into myth, a single moment imbued with meaning far beyond its mechanics, proof that fate can hide in paperwork and flashing lights. But for those who had lived inside the case, the truth felt less dramatic and more unsettling. There was no revelation, no sudden confession, no recovered memory that illuminated everything. There was only accumulation, the slow narrowing of possibilities until one path remained. That path had been chosen not because it was perfect, but because it endured scrutiny better than any other. As years layered over the verdict, the town changed. New businesses opened. Old landmarks disappeared. People who remembered the original disappearance aged, moved, died. The case slipped from daily consciousness, resurfacing only on anniversaries, or when a new retelling found an audience. Its grip loosened, but it never vanished entirely. What lingered was the lesson, passed quietly, rarely articulated, that ordinary moments can carry extraordinary consequence. That systems built on routine sometimes hold dormant answers. That truth does not always announce itself with clarity, but emerges reluctantly, shaped by persistence and chance. The cold case had become history, not because it was forgotten, but because it had been absorbed, integrated into the broader understanding of how justice sometimes arrives late and incomplete. It stood as both resolution and warning, proof that silence can be broken, but also that breaking it leaves echoes. And somewhere along that highway, under layers of asphalt and memory, the night that started it all remained unchanged, indifferent to verdicts and appeals, holding its secrets close, reminding anyone willing to listen that closure is not the same as peace. The years keep moving, but the case does not. It settles into the town like a second shadow, one that lengthens at dusk and never fully disappears. A reminder that some nights do not end when the sun comes up, that some questions do not retreat when the headlines fade. Houses are repainted, children grow taller than their parents, old storefronts become new businesses, but the name at the center of the file remains fixed, typed in black ink on aging paper, repeated in the same order every time someone opens the drawer. Investigators retire. New detectives inherit the boxes. The evidence is logged again, weighed again, stared at under brighter lights that promise clarity and deliver only more doubt. Every detail has been walked through so many times it feels worn smooth, and yet none of it fits cleanly enough to close the door. The traffic stop that seemed so ordinary at the beginning now feels like a mirage, a moment that flashed and vanished, leaving behind a glare that blinds anyone who tries to look straight at it. The community still remembers that night as a fracture, a line that split before and after, when radios crackled with confusion and fear and a name was spoken for the first time in a way no one wanted to hear. The victim's absence is the loudest presence. A chair that stays empty, a birthday that passes without candles, a voice that exists only in recordings played quietly, almost reverently, because playing them too loudly feels like an intrusion. Family members age into new versions of themselves, learning how to carry grief without letting it consume them, but never setting it down entirely. They learn the language of press conferences and police statements, the careful phrases that offer hope without promising anything, the pauses that mean more than the words. They learn to recognize the look in an officer's eyes when there is nothing new to say. They learn patience not because they choose it, but because time forces it upon them. Every phone call triggers a spike of adrenaline. Every knock on the door still carries the possibility of an ending. Years later, they can recite the timeline by heart, can point to the hour where everything went wrong, can describe the weather as if it were a photograph burned into memory. The town's collective memory reshapes itself around the mystery. Stories circulate quietly at first, then louder, then fade, replaced by new ones. A man seen near the road that night who never came forward. A vehicle that matched the description but was never found. A piece of evidence that was logged incorrectly or too late or not at all. Each rumor flares briefly, giving people something to hold on to, something to argue about over coffee or late at night, when the streets are empty and the past feels close. Then the rumor dies like so many before it, leaving behind a residue of disappointment. People want a face to attach to the crime, a clear narrative, a villain who can be named and placed somewhere distant from themselves. What they have instead is a void, an unanswered question that feels uncomfortably close. Inside the case file, the paper tells a different story. It is clinical, restrained, stripped of emotion, times, locations, statements, the language of procedure. Yet even there, between the lines, the uncertainty hums. Margins hold handwritten notes from different eras, different hands, all circling the same points, all asking variations of the same questions. Why did the stop escalate? What was missed in the first minutes, the first hours? Which detail mattered most and why was it overlooked? The file bears the weight of every attempt to make sense of chaos, of every theory built and dismantled. It is thick not because answers were found but because they were not. Technology advances and with it renewed optimism. Old evidence is re-examined with new tools. Techniques that did not exist in 2001 are applied carefully, methodically, as if science itself might apologize for arriving too late. For a moment, the case breathes again. Investigators speak cautiously about possibilities, about results that are promising but not definitive. The town listens, holding its breath, remembering how hope feels and how sharply it can cut when it disappears. Then the updates slow. The language becomes vague again. Promising leads dissolve into technicalities, into probabilities that are not strong enough to carry a charge, let alone a conviction. The file grows heavier. The drawer slides shut once more. What lingers is not just the crime but the sense of interruption. A routine night disrupted by something violent and inexplicable. A reminder that order can fracture without warning. The traffic stop, so ordinary in concept, becomes a symbol of that fragility. People still lower their voices when they talk about it, still glance toward the road where it happened, as if the asphalt itself might remember. For younger residents, the story is a cautionary tale told by parents who were there, who remember the sirens and the fear, who remember how quickly certainty evaporated. For older ones, it is a scar, something they learned to live with but never fully accepted. The unresolved nature of the case exerts a quiet pressure on everyone connected to it. Investigators carry it like unfinished business, a weight that follows them into other cases, other cities, even into retirement. Some still think about it at night, replaying interviews in their heads, wondering if a different question, a different tone might have changed everything. Journalists revisit the story periodically, framing it as a cold case, a mystery, a reminder of justice delayed. Each retelling adds another layer, another interpretation, but the core remains unchanged. No arrest, no confession, no moment where the narrative locks into place. The family continues to live in the space between memory and hope. They mark time not just in years but in anniversaries of the night that took everything apart. They advocate when they can, pushing for attention, for resources, for anyone willing to look again. They also retreat when the weight becomes too heavy, when reopening the wound feels unbearable. They learn to exist with unanswered questions, to build a life that includes grief without being defined entirely by it. But the questions never leave. They wait, patient and relentless, for someone to finally answer them. As the case stretches further into the past, it becomes a mirror reflecting broader anxieties. Trust in systems, the randomness of violence, the limits of certainty. People project their fears onto it, their frustrations, their desire for closure. It stands as proof that not every story resolves neatly, that some remain jagged and incomplete. The phrase cold case takes on a deeper meaning here. Not just a file left unsolved, but an emotional temperature, a chill that never quite lifts. And so the night of that traffic stop continues to echo, not as a single event, but as a series of ripples spreading outward through time. Each ripple touches someone differently. A detective who never forgot, a family member who still waits, a town that learned how quickly normal can disappear. The road looks the same now, cars passing without a second thought, headlights sweeping over asphalt that holds secrets it will never give up willingly. The case remains open not just in a legal sense, but in the minds of everyone who knows the story, everyone who has ever asked what really happened and received only silence in return. There is no final revelation here, no dramatic unmasking, no moment where the truth steps into the light and explains itself. There is only the persistence of the question, the steady beat of it beneath the noise of daily life. It is a reminder that some crimes do not end when the investigation stalls, that their impact continues long after the last official update. The Texas night of 2001 never fully recedes. It lingers unresolved, a shadow at the edge of memory, waiting for an answer that has yet to arrive. The file never closes, it only grows quieter, like a room where the lights are still on but no one speaks above a whisper. Years have layered themselves over the case, each one dulling the sharp edges just enough for people to function, but never enough to forget. The traffic stop remains frozen in time, a few minutes on a dark Texas road that refused to be absorbed by history, a moment that keeps resurfacing whenever someone asks why, whenever someone insists that routine should not end in blood, that ordinary nights should not collapse into permanent questions. The investigators who once worked the scene now speak of it in past tense, yet their eyes betray the present, because the case still lives there, unresolved in a way that feels almost defiant, as if it resists conclusion on purpose. Evidence ages differently than memory. Paper yellows. Plastic grows brittle. Digital files migrate from one system to another, their metadata adjusted, their origins blurred by time. What does not change is the absence of certainty. Every time the evidence is touched again, it brings with it the echo of hope, the fragile belief that this past will be different, that something overlooked will finally announce itself. And every time that belief fractures, results come back inconclusive. Matches hover just below thresholds. Leads promise clarity and deliver silence. The science improves, but the truth remains stubbornly out of reach, as if it exists just beyond the limits of what can be measured. The road itself becomes a quiet monument. There is no plaque, no marker, nothing to tell passing drivers what happened there. And yet for those who know, the stretch of asphalt carries weight. They slow down without realizing why. They glance at the shoulder where lights once flashed and voices once rose in confusion and fear. At night, the darkness feels thicker there, the shadows more deliberate. It is not superstition, not exactly, but memory settling into place, a recognition that something irreversible occurred and left its imprint behind. In the town, the case drifts in and out of conversation, resurfacing on anniversaries, after unrelated crimes, during moments when trust in institutions wavers. People remember how quickly the story traveled, how headlines used words like cold case and mystery and shock before the ink was even dry. They remember the collective intake of breath when updates were promised, the collective exhale when those updates failed to materialize. Over time, the shock transformed into a quieter unease, a shared understanding that some questions might never be answered, that closure is not guaranteed simply because it is deserved. For the family, time is measured differently. It is not divided into years but into before and after, into the life that existed and the one that followed. They live with two realities at once. The one everyone sees, where days pass and responsibilities accumulate, and the private one, where the case is always present, always unfinished. They have learned to navigate conversations with strangers who offer sympathy without knowing the details, with officials who speak carefully, balancing empathy and restraint. They have learned how hope can coexist with resignation, how to keep asking without expecting, how to endure the long quiet stretches between any sign of movement. Occasionally, a new name surfaces, a person of interest whispered about online or mentioned in a late-night segment revisiting the case. Each time it stirs the same reactions: curiosity, skepticism, guarded optimism. People scrutinize timelines, compare photographs, debate motives. For a brief moment, the narrative seems to tilt toward resolution, and then it settles back into ambiguity. The name fades. The speculation dissolves. The case remains exactly where it was, suspended between possibility and proof. Law enforcement agencies acknowledge the case in measured tones. They emphasize commitment without making promises. They remind the public that investigations do not always move in straight lines, that patience is necessary. Privately, some admit the frustration, the sense that the truth is known by someone somewhere, just not in a way that can be proven. The idea that answers exist but remain inaccessible is perhaps the hardest part, a thought that keeps the case alive long after others would have been forgotten. The phrase routine traffic stop takes on an almost bitter irony. It is repeated so often it loses its neutrality, becomes loaded with implication. It stands as a symbol of how quickly normal can unravel, how authority, fear, misunderstanding, and chance can collide in ways no one anticipates. For officers who hear the story during training, it is a cautionary tale. For civilians, it is a reminder of vulnerability. For the community at large, it is a scar that never quite fades. Media revisits add layers to the collective memory, reframing the case for new audiences who did not live through it the first time. Archival footage, solemn narration, dramatic music. Each retelling promises a fresh perspective, a chance that new eyes might see what old ones missed. And each time the ending remains the same. No resolution, no final answer. Just the lingering question, posed again and again, as if repetition might eventually force a reply. As decades approach, the case occupies a strange space between history and present tense. It is old enough to be considered a cold case, yet recent enough to still feel raw to those connected to it. It exists in court records and personal memories, in official statements and quiet conversations, in the gap between what is known and what is suspected. It resists being relegated to the past, insisting instead on its relevance, its unfinished nature. The unresolved ending exerts its own kind of power. It challenges the expectation that every story concludes neatly, that justice always arrives, even if delayed. It forces a confrontation with uncertainty, with the idea that some truths remain hidden not because they are impossible to uncover, but because circumstances conspired to protect them. That discomfort lingers, shaping how people think about safety, about authority, about the thin line between order and chaos. And so the story of that Texas night continues, not as a closed chapter, but as an open wound that has learned to scar without fully healing. It lives on in files and memories, in roads and routines, in the quiet determination of those who still believe answers matter, even when they seem unreachable. The case stands as a testament to absence, to the weight of what is not known, to the enduring echo of a moment that refused to be contained. There is no final scene to fade out on, no decisive moment to bring the lights up and send everyone home. Instead, there is only the steady hum of unresolved truth, the sense that somewhere beneath layers of time and silence, the full story waits. Until it emerges, if it ever does, the case remains what it has always been. A shadow stretching across years, a question without an answer, a reminder that some nights never truly end. Time does not resolve the case, it only changes the way people carry it. What was once sharp becomes heavy instead. A weight settled deep in the collective chest of a town that learned how to live with unanswered questions. The night of the traffic stop no longer dominates daily conversation, but it surfaces in quieter moments, in pauses, in the way people hesitate before trusting the ordinary. The story has been told so many times it feels almost worn, yet each retelling exposes the same raw center, the same missing piece that refuses to be filled. The investigation, officially open, unofficially stalled, exists in a state of perpetual readiness. A phone line remains active. Tips are still logged. Names are still cross-checked against databases that grow larger every year. Investigators insist that no case is ever truly dead. And in theory, that is true. In practice, progress arrives in fragments if it arrives at all. A call from someone who remembers a detail differently now than they did years ago. A document rediscovered during an unrelated audit. A technological update that allows old data to be processed in a new way. Each development is small, almost fragile, and each carries the same question. Will this be enough? The town has learned not to react too strongly anymore. Excitement is tempered by experience. People have been here before, waiting for announcements that led nowhere. They listen carefully, parsing words, noting what is said and what is not. They recognize the signs of optimism and the signals of caution. They know when an update is meaningful and when it is simply procedural. Hope still exists, but it has become cautious, restrained, shaped by years of disappointment. The family remains the emotional core of the story, even as time distances them from the night itself. Their faces change, lines deepen, hair grays, but the connection to the case never loosens. They attend anniversaries and memorials that are not officially sanctioned but deeply personal. They speak to reporters when asked, repeating the same points with quiet determination. They ask for answers not with anger anymore, but with endurance. Their grief has matured into something steadier, less volatile, but no less powerful. It is a presence that does not demand attention, yet commands it when acknowledged. Inside law enforcement circles, the case becomes a reference point, a lesson passed down to new generations. Not as a solved example, but as a warning. About assumptions. About time. About the importance of the first moments after an incident, when details are fragile and decisions carry consequences that may not be understood until years later. Officers learn the story during training not because it offers closure but because it does not. Because it illustrates how quickly a routine can become irreversible, how easily uncertainty can harden into permanence. The road where it happened continues to absorb the flow of traffic, indifferent and unchanged. Daylight erases its menace, turning it into just another stretch of pavement bordered by familiar landmarks. At night, however, it reclaims its gravity. Headlights sweep across the same ground where confusion once ruled, where voices overlapped and fear filled the air. Drivers pass through unaware, their lives uninterrupted, while the memory of that night remains anchored to the location, invisible but persistent. Every so often, someone new becomes obsessed with the case. Podcaster, a writer, An amateur investigator convinced that the answer lies hidden in plain sight. They collect documents, map timelines, interview anyone willing to talk. They bring fresh energy, fresh questions, and sometimes uncover inconsistencies that reignite interest. For a while it feels as though momentum is building, as though the silence might finally break. Then reality asserts itself. The same barriers reappear. The same gaps refuse to close. Enthusiasm fades, replaced by the realization that curiosity alone cannot overcome the absence of proof. The case's endurance transforms it into something more than an investigation. It becomes a symbol of unresolved justice, of institutional limits, of the uneasy space between what is known and what can be proven. It forces uncomfortable conversations about accountability and transparency, about how much trust people place in systems designed to protect them. It lingers as a reminder that certainty is not guaranteed, even when the stakes are high. As years stretch into decades, the case drifts closer to history, yet never quite crosses the line. It remains too vivid, too personal, to be relegated to textbooks or footnotes. It exists instead in a living archive of memory, updated not by breakthroughs, but by the passage of time itself. Each year without resolution adds another layer, another reason for the question to persist. The phrase cold case feels almost misleading here. Cold implies inactivity, neglect, abandonment. This case is none of those things. It is watched, monitored, revisited. It is alive in the sense that it continues to affect people, to influence decisions, to shape perceptions. What it lacks is not attention but certainty. And certainty, once lost, is the hardest thing to recover. The absence of an ending creates its own narrative tension. There is no release, no moment where grief transforms into relief. Instead, there is a sustained ache, a prolonged uncertainty that resists resolution. People learn to coexist with it, but they do not accept it fully. Acceptance would mean letting go, and letting go feels like betrayal. So the story remains open, unfinished by design or by fate. Late at night, when the town is quiet and the road is empty, the memory of that traffic stop feels closer. Not louder, not more dramatic, but heavier. It settles into the silence, reminding anyone who thinks about it that some moments echo far beyond their immediate impact. That a few minutes on a dark road can ripple outward, touching lives for years, reshaping a community's sense of safety and certainty. There are no final credits to roll, no definitive statement to issue. The case does not conclude, it endures. It exists as a question mark etched into the town's history, a space where an answer should be. Until that space is filled, if it ever is, the story continues to breathe quietly, patiently, waiting for the one detail, the one voice, the one moment that might finally shift it from mystery to memory. And so the Texas night remains unresolved, suspended between past and present, between what happened and what can be proven. The road keeps carrying traffic. The file stays open. The question persists. In the absence of answers, the silence speaks, and it says only this: some stories do not end when we want them to. Some simply remain, demanding to be remembered.